My name is Denise Calloway. I'm 41 years old, and last Thanksgiving, 4 months into hospice care for stage 3C ovarian cancer, my father looked around a table he thought I couldn't hear him from and told my uncle that all of this had been a real inconvenience for the family this year. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the $1,200 a month in hospice costs our insurance didn't cover wasn't coming from any fund he'd quietly set up or any GoFundMe my sister had started. It was coming from a retirement account I'd been liquidating in $300 increments and a stack of freelance tutoring sessions I was still teaching from my bed. And in 6 weeks, a hospice financial counselor with absolutely nothing to gain from the moment was going to say that number out loud in front of my entire family without knowing what it would do to the room. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been called a burden by the person who should have carried some of the weight, comment, "I've been there" below. This one's for you. I've worked as a high school guidance counselor for 14 years, which means I've spent most of my career being the person other people bring their crises to, not the other way around. I'm good at it, genuinely. I'm also, by nature and by long habit, someone who doesn't ask for help easily, who'd rather quietly solve a problem than let anyone watch me struggle with it. That instinct served me fine for most of my life. It served me considerably less well once I actually needed help and didn't know how to ask for it from the one person whose approval I'd spent 40 years chasing. I think I gravitated toward counseling, partly because it let me be endlessly useful to other people's crises while keeping my own carefully off stage. Students would come into my office in genuine distress, and I'd feel entirely competent, entirely in control, helping them name what they were feeling and find a path through it. I never once, in 14 years, sat in someone else's office and did the same thing for myself. I told myself that was just professional boundary keeping. Looking back, I think it was really just an extension of a much older habit, one that started long before I ever had a counseling degree. My father, Gerald, is 68, a retired plant supervisor who ran his department the way he ran his household, efficiently, without much room for what he'd call fuss. He's not a cruel man in any conventional sense. He never raised a hand to any of us, never said an unkind word about our appearances or our choices in the way some fathers do. What he never learned, in 68 years, was how to sit with fear without turning it into irritation, and I think that gap explains more about what happened at that Thanksgiving table than anything else in this story. I remember, at 11, breaking my wrist falling off my bike in front of our house, and my father's first reaction wasn't concern. It was a kind of brisk, business-like efficiency, getting me into the car, driving to urgent care without much conversation along the way. He paid the bill, made sure I healed properly, did everything a responsible father does. What he never did, that day or in the weeks after, was ask me how scared I'd been, or sit with me while I cried about the cast itching under the July heat. He handled the logistics of my pain flawlessly. He never once touched the feeling of it. My grandfather, Gerald's own father, was harder still, a man who considered any expression of worry a personal weakness, who once made my father finish a full shift with a broken finger rather than make a fuss at the hospital. My father has told that story himself, more than once, always with a strange note of pride in his voice, rather than the horror I felt hearing it as a child. I think he inherited a very specific idea from that upbringing, that love, properly expressed, looks like stoicism, and that anything resembling visible worry is something to be managed rather than felt. My mother, Carol, isn't cold the way my father can be, but she's spent 40 years learning to work around him, rather than push against him directly. I think of her as a kind of emotional translator in our family, quietly softening his blunt edges for the rest of us, absorbing the discomfort of his silences so the rest of the household didn't have to. It's a role that served the family's surface harmony well for decades. It also meant that nobody ever really had to confront the gap in what he was capable of offering, because she'd already, quietly, filled it in. I was diagnosed with stage 3C ovarian cancer 14 months before that Thanksgiving, discovered after months of vague, dismissible symptoms, bloating, fatigue, the kind of things every woman is told to ignore until she can't anymore. The initial treatment was aggressive: a debulking surgery, 6 rounds of chemotherapy, a second surgery when imaging showed the first hadn't gotten everything. I told my parents everything, plainly, at every stage. My father's response, consistently, was some version of asking about logistics: who was driving me to appointments, whether I'd need time off work. Never once, in 14 months, asking how I was actually doing with any of it. I want to describe that first diagnosis day specifically because I've never told anyone the full shape of it, not even Nathan. I drove myself to the appointment, having half expected some kind of ordinary explanation for the symptoms I'd been having, and I remember sitting alone in my car afterward for almost 40 minutes before I could make myself call anyone. I called Nathan first, then my mother. I called my father last, and I remember rehearsing the sentence 3 times in my head before dialing, trying to find a version of "I have cancer" that wouldn't sound, somehow, too dramatic. 10 months in, a routine scan found new growth, more extensive and less operable than the original tumor. My oncologist, Dr. Ferris, was honest with me in the specific, careful way good oncologists learn to be, that further aggressive treatment carried diminishing returns, that we were moving from a fight for remission conversation into a quality of life conversation. I remember driving home from that appointment and calling my mother first, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me, given what I'd just been told. I told my parents together, at their kitchen table, as plainly as I could manage. The cancer's come back in a way they can't operate on again. We're looking at hospice-level care now, focused on comfort rather than cure. My mother cried immediately, reaching for my hand. My father sat very still for a long moment, and then asked, "So does this mean you won't be able to help with the holiday planning this year?" I told him I genuinely didn't know. I didn't have the energy in that moment to feel the full weight of what the question actually revealed. I remember, sitting at my parents' kitchen table delivering that news, feeling the specific, familiar urge to reassure them, to manage their reaction the way I'd have managed a student's crisis, even while delivering my own terminal prognosis. I found myself saying things like, "The hospice team is really wonderful," and "we're going to focus on making the time count," language I'd later realize was doing exactly what I always did, softening my own reality to protect everyone else's comfort, even in the single conversation where I most needed someone to sit with the full, unsoftened weight of it alongside me. I want to sit with my father's question a little longer because I've come to understand it slightly differently with time. "Does this mean you won't be able to help with the holiday planning?" was, on its face, a strange, almost cruel thing to ask upon hearing your daughter has entered hospice care. But I've since wondered whether it was also, in its own broken way, an attempt to locate something concrete and manageable inside a piece of news too large for him to process directly, logistics being the only vocabulary he had available in that moment for something that had, in truth, left him utterly speechless. Hospice enrollment began within a few weeks, a team of nurses and aides visiting regularly, my daily life reorganized around managing symptoms rather than fighting the disease itself. My husband, Nathan, took on most of the caregiving alongside his job, exhausted in ways I could see even through my own exhaustion. My parents visited occasionally, my mother more often than my father, always the same careful, surface-level conversations, never quite landing on how frightened any of us actually were. I want to give Nathan more space here, because he carried an enormous amount that year that I only fully appreciated much later. He worked full days as a project manager, then came home to manage medications, appointments, the specific physical demands of caregiving, all while trying to hold down his own grief about what was happening to me. I remember him falling asleep, sitting upright in the chair beside my bed, more than once, still in his work clothes, and waking with a start whenever I stirred, instantly alert, checking whether I needed anything. He never once complained to me directly. I found out much later, from Angela, that he'd cried in his car in our driveway more than a few times before coming inside, wanting to compose himself before I could see it. My younger sister, Renee, 36, lives 2 states away with her own young kids, and made the trip to see me more times that year than I expected, given the distance and the complications of her own life. She never had my father's difficulty sitting with hard things. She'd cry openly, ask direct questions, hold my hand through appointments over video call when she couldn't be there in person. I've thought often about how differently two children raised by the same stoic father can end up processing fear. Renee and I talked once, during one of her visits, about why our father had turned out this way, and she offered a theory I hadn't fully considered. I think part of it is that you were always the one who didn't need managing, she said. You handled your own stuff so well growing up that Dad never had to learn how to sit with you in something hard. I made him practice that muscle a lot more than you ever did, honestly, just by being messier about my feelings. I laughed at that, surprised by how true it felt. I'd spent my whole life being easy, and easy, it turned out, had never actually taught him anything. I want to explain something about those months that mattered enormously and that nobody in my family fully understood at the time. Our insurance covered the core hospice services, but a significant gap remained. Supplemental nursing hours, certain medications, equipment upgrades that made a real difference in my comfort, but weren't fully reimbursed. Rather than ask my parents for help, I started taking on freelance tutoring sessions from my bed on the days I had energy, video calls with high school students working through algebra and essay drafts, quietly building a small stream of income to cover what insurance didn't. I want to describe what those tutoring sessions actually looked like because I think the detail matters. I'd prop myself up on pillows, camera angled carefully to hide the hospital equipment beside my bed, and spend 45 minutes helping a 16-year-old work through quadratic equations, my voice steady, my focus complete, giving those students the same full presence I'd have given them in my office years earlier. None of them ever knew what the rest of the frame contained. There was something strange and almost sustaining about those calls, a version of myself that still felt useful, still felt like the capable person I'd always been, even while everything else about my life had narrowed down to hospital visits and medication schedules. There was one night, about 2 months into the tutoring arrangement, when a severe bout of nausea from a new medication hit right before a scheduled session, and I nearly canceled, genuinely unsure I could get through 45 minutes without needing to stop. I pushed through it anyway, propped up with extra pillows, a cool washcloth on my neck just out of camera view, gripping through the session on sheer determination. Afterward, I lay back, exhausted in a way that went beyond the illness itself, and cried quietly, not from the nausea, but from the sheer loneliness of doing something that hard entirely by myself, with nobody in my family even aware it was happening. I've thought a lot about why I didn't simply ask my parents for financial help, given that they were, by most measures, comfortable enough to offer it. Part of it was pride, the same instinct that had shaped my whole career of solving other people's problems rather than presenting my own. Part of it, I think, was a quieter, harder truth. Some part of me already suspected that asking would be received as one more inconvenient request, and I didn't have the emotional reserves left to find out I was right. I also began liquidating a modest retirement account I'd built over 14 years of teaching, pulling out a few $100s at a time to cover the growing gap, a decision I made alone, without discussing it with Nathan, until the withdrawals had already become a pattern. He wasn't upset when I finally told him. He was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I wish you'd told me sooner. You shouldn't have to carry this by yourself." I told him I didn't know how to carry it any other way. I'd never learned. I want to expand on Nathan's reaction when he finally learned about the retirement withdrawals, because it was more layered than simple concern. He wasn't angry, exactly, but he was hurt in a specific way I hadn't anticipated. Hurt that I hadn't trusted him enough to let him carry part of this with me, even as he was already carrying so much of the physical caregiving. "I know you're used to protecting people from your problems," he said. "But I'm your husband. Protecting me from this isn't love. It's just isolation with better manners." I didn't have a response to that for a long time. I've thought about that sentence often since, turning it over, recognizing how much of my life had been built on exactly that confusion. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, 4 months into hospice, I was weaker than I'd been in months, but I wanted to be there. Some instinct telling me, even without saying it aloud, that this might be one of my last ordinary holidays with the full family gathered. Nathan drove me the 20 minutes to my parents' house, and I sat through most of the afternoon in the armchair by the window rather than at the table, conserving energy for the meal itself. I want to describe the specific effort it took just to decide to attend that Thanksgiving, because it wasn't a small decision. I'd had a difficult week symptom-wise, and my hospice nurse had gently suggested I consider staying home and resting instead. I pushed back, telling her I wanted to be there, that some part of me needed the ordinary rhythm of a family holiday even in the middle of everything else. Nathan supported the decision without pushing me either way, simply saying, "Whatever you want, I'll make it work." I put on real clothes for the first time in a week, let Renee do my hair over video call beforehand to give me something to look forward to, and told myself, driving over, that this was going to be a good day. Late in the afternoon, my Uncle Frank asked my father, quietly but not quietly enough, how everyone was holding up, with everything going on with Denise. I was resting nearby, eyes closed, and I heard my father's answer clearly. It's been a real inconvenience for the family this year, honestly. We had to move the 4th of July plans, missed my retirement party, everyone's schedule's been a mess. He said it the way you'd describe a scheduling conflict, not the way you'd describe your daughter's terminal diagnosis, and I understood, in that moment, exactly how he'd been metabolizing the entire ordeal. I want to include a bit more of what my father said, because the full exchange revealed even more than the single line I've already described. My Uncle Frank pushed back gently, saying something like, "It's been hard on Denise too, I'd imagine, more than on anyone." My father's response was, "Well, sure, obviously, but I mean for the rest of us, trying to plan anything around chemo schedules, not knowing from week to week what shape she'll be in, it just makes everything harder to organize." He wasn't being deliberately cruel. He genuinely seemed to be describing, in his mind, a logistics problem rather than his daughter's fight for her life, and that gap, between what he thought he was describing and what he was actually describing, was the whole devastating shape of the moment. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't say anything at all, in that moment, though every part of me wanted to. I lay there, pretending to rest, absorbing a sentence that reduced 14 months of chemotherapy, 2 surgeries, and a hospice enrollment to a scheduling inconvenience, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me even through my exhaustion, that I'd spent my entire life anticipating exactly this reaction and building my whole personality around avoiding it. Nathan had heard the comment too, standing closer to the kitchen doorway, and I watched his jaw tighten in a way I rarely saw from him. He didn't say anything in the moment either, respecting, I think, that this wasn't his confrontation to start. But on the drive home, he was quiet for a long stretch before finally saying, "I don't think I can sit through another one of these dinners pretending that comment didn't happen." I told him I understood completely, and that I didn't have the answer yet for what to do about it. Once we were home, I finally let myself cry, something I'd been holding back through the entire drive, keeping my composure until I no longer had to. Nathan held me and didn't try to fix anything or offer reassurance about my father's intentions. He just said, "You don't have to make sense of it tonight. You're allowed to just be hurt." It was such a small permission, and it mattered enormously. Nobody in my family had ever really given me that kind of unconditional space to simply feel something without also managing it for everyone else's comfort. I want to describe the specific internal narration running through my head on that drive home from Thanksgiving, because I think it captures something important about the whole pattern. I remember thinking, almost automatically, he probably didn't mean it the way it sounded. He's just bad with words under stress. I caught myself doing it, actively constructing my father's excuse for him, before I'd even had the chance to feel the full weight of what he'd said. It was such a practiced, immediate reflex that I didn't fully register, until much later, how strange it was to defend someone's comment about you before you'd even given yourself permission to be hurt by it. I called my closest friend, Angela, the next day and told her the whole thing, my voice flatter than I meant it to sound. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Denise, you've spent your whole life making sure nobody has to deal with the inconvenient parts of you. I think your dad just told you, out loud, that even dying isn't inconvenient enough to earn you a different response." I didn't have anything to say back to that for a long moment. It was, I think, the most precisely accurate thing anyone had said about my family in years. Angela told me something about her own family history that I hadn't known before. offering it not to compare our situations but to explain why she understood the particular loneliness of my dynamic with my father. Her own father had responded to her mother's cancer diagnosis years earlier with a similar deflection, throwing himself into home renovation projects, reorganizing the garage obsessively, anything that let him feel useful without having to sit with the fear directly. I think some people literally don't have the internal architecture for sitting still inside grief, she said. It doesn't excuse it, but it helped me understand my dad wasn't choosing cruelty, he just genuinely didn't know another way to survive it. I asked my mother, a few days later, whether she'd heard my father's comment. She admitted she had, and that she hadn't corrected him in the moment, hoping, she said, that it wouldn't reach me since I'd seemed to be resting. I told her that not correcting him hadn't protected me from anything. It had just meant I found out on my own, alone, pretending to be asleep. She didn't have a good response to that. I don't think she'd considered, until I said it plainly, that her silence had its own cost. I want to include more of that conversation with my mother, because it wasn't a single exchange but an ongoing, uncomfortable few weeks of circling the same subject. She called me several times after that initial conversation, each time trying a slightly different angle, explaining her own frustration with my father over the years, apologizing again for not speaking up at Thanksgiving, asking if there was anything she could do differently going forward. I appreciated the effort, even as I noticed the pattern in it. My mother trying to fix the relationship between me and my father by managing her own guilt about it, rather than by actually pushing him to change anything himself. I need to introduce someone here who had absolutely no idea about any of this family dynamic. Miriam Castellano, the hospice program's financial counselor, 18 years into a career helping families navigate exactly the kind of coverage gaps I'd been quietly absorbing on my own. She scheduled a routine benefits review meeting about 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, standard practice for hospice patients approaching a new insurance quarter, and asked, as she always did, whether family members would like to attend to understand the full financial picture going forward. I want to establish Miriam a bit more before the meeting itself, because her ordinariness matters to the story. She'd been our family's assigned financial counselor since hospice enrollment began, someone we'd interacted with mostly through brief phone calls about paperwork and coverage updates. She was kind, efficient, entirely unremarkable in the way good administrative professionals often are. You don't notice how well someone is doing their job until the moment it happens to intersect with something much larger than the job itself. None of us thought of her as anyone significant to this story until that Tuesday afternoon in the small conference room. My parents came to that meeting, along with Nathan and Renee, all of us gathered in a small conference room at the hospice office. Miriam walked through the coverage plainly, what Medicare's hospice benefit covered, what fell outside it, and then, checking her records, mentioned entirely as routine administrative detail, I see the supplemental nursing hours and equipment upgrades have been self-pay from the patient directly, about $1,200 a month on average. Do you want to talk through whether that's still sustainable going forward, or discuss other coverage options? I want to explain why I'd agreed to let my parents attend that particular benefits meeting, given everything that had happened at Thanksgiving. Part of it was practical. Miriam had explained that decisions about coverage sometimes benefited from having more than one person present to help retain the details. But part of it, I think, was a quieter, less examined hope that if my family sat in a room and heard the actual mechanics of my care laid out plainly, something might shift that hadn't shifted through any conversation I'd tried to have with them directly. My father went very still. "Self-pay from Denise?" he asked, and Miriam, checking the file again, confirmed it plainly. My own account, my own withdrawals, documented in the exact way hospice billing requires. She had no idea what that sentence was about to do to the room. She simply moved on to the next line item, assuming, reasonably, that this was already understood by everyone present. I want to include the specific numbers Miriam read aloud, because their precision was part of what made them impossible to soften afterward. Since enrollment, patient self-pay has totaled approximately $7,400 across supplemental nursing hours, a hospital bed upgrade, and medication copays not covered under the standard benefit, she said, reading directly from the file. Hearing my own quiet sacrifice reduced to a specific dollar figure, spoken in Miriam's calm, administrative voice, was strange, almost more powerful for how unemotional the delivery was. It wasn't framed as heroism or hardship. It was simply an accounting, and accountings, I've learned, carry a particular kind of unavoidable weight. My father turned to me, something shifting visibly across his face. "You've been paying for this yourself? This whole time?" I told him yes, quietly, that I hadn't wanted to ask anyone for help, that I'd found other ways to cover it. He was quiet for a long moment, and then said, almost to himself, "I called this an inconvenience to you at Thanksgiving. You were paying for your own hospice care, doing tutoring calls from your bed, and I called it an inconvenience." I want to describe what it felt like, watching my father's face, as the number and its source landed on him. I didn't feel triumphant, despite 14 months of hurt sitting behind every softened comment I'd absorbed from him. I felt, mostly, a strange tenderness toward the version of him sitting in that chair. A man finally, forcibly, confronted with a gap between what he'd assumed and what had actually been happening, with no comfortable way to look away from it. I reached over and put my hand on his arm, an instinct I didn't fully examine in the moment, some part of me still, even then, more concerned with managing his discomfort than sitting fully in my own vindication. My mother started crying immediately, reaching for my hand the way she had the day I first told them about the recurrence. "I knew you were tired all the time, and I thought it was just the treatment. I never once thought to ask if you were working. I should have asked." I told her I hadn't wanted anyone to know, that some part of me had been protecting a version of myself that didn't need help, even when I very clearly did. Renee, sitting beside me, put her arm around my shoulders and said, quietly, to our father, "This is what I've been trying to tell you for months. She never asks for anything. That doesn't mean she doesn't need it." My father didn't argue with her. He just sat there, absorbing a version of the last 14 months that was entirely different from the one he'd apparently been telling himself. Miriam, realizing partway through the meeting that she'd walked into something larger than a routine benefits review, handled it with a grace I've appreciated since. She didn't apologize for raising the number. There was nothing to apologize for. It was simply the truth of the file in front of her. She just said, gently, to the room, "I see families work through moments like this fairly often. What matters now is what you all decide to do with the information, not how it arrived." Miriam called me a few days after that meeting. Something she told me wasn't standard procedure, but that she'd felt compelled to do anyway. "I hope I didn't overstep, bringing that number up without knowing the full context," she said. I told her she hadn't overstepped at all, that she'd inadvertently done something for my family that I'd been unable to do myself in 14 months of trying. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I've been doing this work a long time, and I've noticed that families often need the facts to come from somewhere outside the relationship itself. I'm glad I could be that, even by accident." I've thought about that phrase since, outside the relationship itself, as one of the more precise descriptions I've heard for exactly what happened that day. My father asked, before we left that meeting, whether he could take over the supplemental costs going forward. I told him I'd think about it. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to refuse out of a kind of stubborn pride, the same instinct that had gotten me into this situation in the first place. I didn't refuse. I let him, finally, do something concrete instead of simply commenting on the inconvenience of it all. The drive home from Miriam's office was almost entirely silent, my father driving me himself for once instead of Nathan, both of us processing the afternoon in our own ways. About halfway home, he said, without any lead-in, "I keep doing the math. 14 months. All those tutoring calls. I never once asked what you actually needed. I just asked what needed rescheduling." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence sit between us, instead of rushing to reassure him the way I always had before. Eventually, I just said, "You're doing it now." "That counts for something." He nodded, eyes on the road, and neither of us said much else the rest of the way. My father's visits changed noticeably in the weeks that followed. Longer, more frequent, and increasingly focused on actual questions about how I was doing, rather than logistics. He started sitting with me during some of my worst days, not saying much, just present in the room, which was, for a man of his temperament, a significant departure from anything I'd known from him before. I remember the first time my father came over specifically to just sit with me, no logistics to manage, no errand to run. He brought a chess set, something we hadn't played together since I was a teenager, and set it up on my bed tray without much explanation. We played 3 games that afternoon, barely talking, and at the end he said, almost sheepishly, "I don't really know how to do this part, sitting still with you like this." But I wanted to try. It wasn't eloquent. It was, from him, an enormous, deliberate act of learning a language late in life that he'd never been taught to speak. My mother's shift, in the months after that meeting, showed up less in grand gestures and more in a new willingness to speak plainly when it mattered. At a family dinner a few months later, when my aunt made an offhand comment implying I must be doing better since the scare passed, my mother corrected her immediately, gently but firmly. "It's not really a scare that's passed. It's an ongoing thing Denise is managing carefully, and I think it matters that we talk about it accurately." It was such a small moment, but it was the first time in my life I'd heard my mother contradict someone at a family gathering rather than smooth over the awkwardness of an inaccurate comment. I noticed. I don't think she knew how much. About 2 months after that meeting, a new development changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Dr. Ferris mentioned an experimental trial I might qualify for, a targeted therapy showing promising early results in patients with my specific tumor markers. I want to be careful here, because I know how these things can sound. I wasn't expecting a miracle, and neither was my medical team. But the trial accepted me, and within 10 weeks, my tumor markers had dropped further and faster than anyone anticipated. I want to describe the specific phone call about the trial, because I remember it clearly, sitting in the same armchair by the window I'd rested in that Thanksgiving. Dr. Ferris was careful, as always, not to overpromise. She explained the trial's early phase results, the possibility that it might not work for me the way it had for other patients, and asked if I wanted to consider it despite the uncertainty. I said yes almost before she finished the sentence. Some part of me, I think, had been waiting for exactly this kind of possibility without letting myself hope for it directly. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, I formally transitioned out of hospice care and back into active treatment, a genuinely unusual reversal that my whole medical team treated with careful, measured optimism rather than triumph. I'm not in remission in any guaranteed, permanent sense. Cancer like mine requires ongoing vigilance, and I know that. But I've had more good months since than anyone expected me to have, and I've tried to hold that gift without taking it for granted. I want to note something about leaving hospice care that surprised me. A genuine, complicated grief mixed in with the relief. The nurses who'd cared for me for months, who'd seen me at my most vulnerable, celebrated the news with real warmth, and one of them, a nurse named Patricia who'd been with our family from the beginning, hugged me and said, "This is the best kind of goodbye I get to give." Most of them aren't like this. I hadn't expected to cry saying goodbye to a hospice team, but I did, grateful in a way that felt larger than words for the specific, skilled tenderness they'd brought to some of the hardest months of my life. My father cried, for the first time in my adult life that I've witnessed, the day I told him about leaving hospice. He didn't say much beyond, "I don't know how to tell you what this means to me," which, from a man who'd spent 68 years avoiding exactly that kind of sentence, felt like more than words could have carried anyway. I want to include one more small detail before closing this out. The day I finally told my regular tutoring students the truth about where those sessions had been happening from. Most of them had no idea I was ill at all, let alone that I'd been teaching from a hospice bed. When I mentioned it, gently, to explain why I'd be pausing sessions briefly to celebrate the good news, one of them wrote back, "You never once seemed like anything was wrong. You were always just fully there for me." I've kept that message. It reminded me that showing up fully for other people, even while falling apart quietly myself, had been the one part of this whole ordeal I never had to relearn. In the months since, my father has continued showing up in ways that would have been unthinkable before that meeting with Miriam, driving me to follow-up appointments himself, asking specific, informed questions about my scans, and once, unprompted, telling a cousin at a family gathering, "My daughter's been through more than most people could survive, and she's still teaching kids algebra from her hospital bed when she has the energy." I don't know anyone tougher. I didn't correct the framing this time. I let it stand. I want to mention one specific, concrete gesture my father made once the immediate crisis had passed. He insisted, without my asking, on replenishing the retirement account I'd drained, transferring a lump sum that roughly matched what I'd withdrawn over those months. I tried to refuse it at first, the old instinct rising automatically. He wouldn't hear it. "You shouldn't have had to make that choice alone in the first place," he said. "Let me undo at least the part of it I actually can." It was, in its own way, one of the more articulate things he's ever said to me, even though the sentence itself was simple. I've thought a great deal, since that meeting, about the specific shape of the harm in my family. Not cruelty exactly, but a generational inability to let fear look like fear, passed down from a man who once finished a factory shift on a broken finger, rather than admit he was hurting. I think my father's comment at Thanksgiving wasn't really about me being inconvenient. I think it was the only language he had for being terrified of losing his daughter, filtered through decades of training that said fear had to come out sounding like something else entirely. I also came to understand something less comfortable about my own part in this pattern, something I hadn't fully sat with until months after the meeting with Miriam. My lifelong instinct to handle everything myself hadn't just been a response to my father's stoicism. It had also, in its own way, given him permission to remain stoic, since I'd never actually forced the issue by asking for help and needing him to either show up or visibly fail to. I'm not saying that excuses his comment at Thanksgiving, but I've come to see my own silence as a kind of quiet collaborator in the very dynamic that hurt me, and untangling that has been its own separate, ongoing piece of work. If you've spent your life quietly solving your own problems rather than risk being told they're too much trouble, I'd tell you this: the people who love you can't carry weight they don't know you're holding. I nearly went through the hardest year of my life entirely alone, financially and emotionally, because I'd built my whole identity around not needing anyone. You're allowed to say the true, heavy version of what you're going through, even to people who've disappointed you before. Sometimes the truth finds its own way to the surface regardless. I'd rather it had come from me. I told Angela the whole arc of what had happened, once things had settled, and she listened quietly before saying something that reframed the whole story for me. "I think the cancer forced a kind of honesty your family had been avoiding for decades," she said. "Not just about money, about everything. Your dad's stoicism, your mom's conflict avoidance, your own instinct to disappear your own needs. None of that was sustainable forever. I just wish it hadn't taken something this serious to finally break it open." I told her I agreed completely, and that I'd stopped wishing it had happened differently, because wishing that felt like wasting the genuine good that had actually come from it. Renee told me that her own relationship with our father shifted noticeably in the aftermath, even though she hadn't been the one directly hurt by his comment. "I think watching him finally get it with you made me braver about pushing him on other things," she said. "I asked him last month, straight out, why he never came to any of my kids' school events when they were little. He actually answered me, instead of deflecting. I hadn't expected my own hard year to open a door for Renee's separate, older grievances, but I understood, hearing it, that families sometimes heal in these ripple patterns, one honest reckoning making the next one slightly more possible. My father and I have kept up the chess games since that first afternoon, a standing arrangement now, once every couple of weeks, ostensibly about the game, but really about the sitting still itself. He's gotten slightly better at asking real questions during those games, not dramatic, searching questions, just ordinary ones. How are you sleeping? Does the new medication have side effects? Delivered between moves, almost as if the chessboard gives him permission to ask what he still can't quite ask directly, face to face, without something to look at instead of me. And if you're the parent in a story like this one, if fear has ever come out of your mouth sounding like irritation instead of love, the way it did for my father, I'd ask you to consider naming that gap to the people you love, even imperfectly, even if the words feel foreign. My father never delivered some polished, therapist-approved apology. He learned to play chess with me again instead, and to ask small, real questions between moves. It wasn't eloquent. It was, in the end, more than enough, because it was finally, unmistakably, true. It's been just over a year now since that Thanksgiving comment, and about 6 months since I formally left hospice care. My scans remain encouraging, though I know better than to treat that as a permanent guarantee. I live now with a kind of watchful gratitude I didn't have before any of this, aware of how precarious good news can be, even when it holds. My father has come to every single follow-up scan appointment since, sitting in the waiting room the entire time, phone away, fully present in a way that would have been unrecognizable to me 2 years ago. I had a student in my office a few weeks ago, dealing with her own mother's illness, minimizing her own fear the same way I once minimized mine, telling me she didn't want to make a big deal out of asking her family for support. I recognized so much of myself in her that I found myself saying something I don't think I'd have been capable of saying with real conviction 2 years earlier. The people who love you can't read your mind, I told her. Not because they don't care, but because most of us were never taught how to ask the right questions, or to volunteer what we're carrying without being asked. You get to teach them, if you're willing to go first. She looked at me for a long moment, and I don't know if it landed the way I hoped. I know it was the truest thing I could have told her. Nathan and I talked, not long ago, about the whole arc of that year, the diagnosis, the hospice enrollment, the Thanksgiving comment, the meeting with Miriam, the trial that changed everything. He said something I've held on to since. I think the scariest part wasn't the cancer itself. It was watching you almost go through all of it, completely alone, by choice, because you didn't think you were allowed to need anyone. I told him he was right, and that the illness, terrifying as it was, had also taught me something I don't think I'd have learned any other way, that being fully known, weaknesses and all, was its own kind of survival. I don't think of my father as a villain, even now, even remembering exactly how that Thanksgiving comment felt landing on me from across the room. I think of him as a man who inherited a broken instrument for expressing love and spent 68 years not realizing it was broken until a hospice financial counselor, with no idea what she was doing, finally handed him a number he couldn't reframe his way around. I'm still here, still teaching, still occasionally exhausted in ways this illness has taught me to simply accept. My father calls every Sunday now, not to ask about logistics, but just to ask how I'm actually doing. It took almost losing me for him to learn the question. I'm grateful, more than I can easily say, that he finally did. I don't know how many more good months I have ahead of me, and I've stopped needing a guarantee in order to feel grateful for the ones I've already gotten. What I know for certain is that my father learned, at 68, to sit across a chessboard from his daughter and ask real questions between moves, and that's a language he'll carry for whatever years he has left, long after this particular chapter of our story has closed. Some inheritances take a lifetime to arrive. I'm glad in the end that this one finally did. If you've ever quietly carried more than anyone in your family realized, I'd love to hear how it happened and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.